Hey guys, today we're going to talk about the U.S. Constitution's principles. This again is a follow-up to that textbook reading from earlier that I said was a really important one. Wanted to reinforce some of the principles contained in the Constitution. This is an overview of what we're going to talk about. As you can see, I've kind of linked up the four of the six principles that go together: popular sovereignty and limited government, separation of powers, checks and balances, and then we'll consider federalism and judicial review in turn as well. Popular sovereignty is the idea that the national government gets its power from the people. Thus, consider the words of the preamble, the first words: "We, the people, do hereby ordain this Constitution, create this Constitution." The Declaration of Independence was a document that was written because the British failed to keep in mind the rights of the British colonists. In addition, the Declaration of Independence captured these Lockean principles of the social contract, that people are the source of government's power. Consider the words of the Declaration of Independence. In order to protect those rights, the inalienable rights, governments are created amongst men, deriving their just power from the governed. Deriving their just power from the governed is this idea of popular sovereignty. The government gets its just powers from the people that created the government. Okay, people are the only source of governmental power. There is no independent source of power for the national government. Okay, it doesn't get power from other countries. It doesn't get power from itself, clearly. It only gets the power that the people give it. Now, if you only have one source of power, the people, then you're necessarily a government of limited scope. Government can only exercise those powers given to it by the people. Okay? Now, think of it in this way. Who's subordinated, or who is above who in the following scenario? You have the people and then the government. Okay? The people create the government. Thus, you would think the people are above the government. And in fact, you'd be right. The people, having created the government, are above it. They decide how much power the government has. Okay? Now, if the people are subject to laws that government creates, and government is subordinated, is below the people for whom laws are created, if the people are controlled by the laws, shouldn't government be controlled by the same laws too? And that idea is referred to as the rule of law. Okay, the idea that government is liable or subject to the same laws and rules as ordinary citizens, again, who are above the government. Consider this as well. A government of laws is one where you have principles guiding policy making, where the government is restricted in what it can do, at least by the laws that it's created. A government of man, a government by men, means laws don't apply unless the government decides it applies to them. Okay, that's a lawless situation which allows for a dictatorship to arise. Okay, it's a really important idea. This rule of law is a really important idea, and it's a subset of this idea of limited government. So, putting these two ideas together, if government gets its power from the people, popular sovereignty, and the people are the only source of power for the government, then the government is one of limited power. Now, if the government is not above the law, because the people are the source of laws, then the government has to follow all the rules, the rule of law, okay, just like everybody else. Okay, so popular sovereignty and limited government, they go together, okay? The next two principles that fit together are separation of powers and checks and balances. Now, the Constitution separates the power of government among three co-equal branches of government. How do we know that? Well, we know that because when you read the Constitution, Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution contains the line, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in Congress. Means all the legislative powers go to Congress. Okay, well, who can exercise all the legislative powers? Congress. How do we know that? It's in the Constitution, and that's the fundamental law for the country. Article 2, Section 1, the executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States. Okay, who can exercise the executive power? Can the legislative branch exercise executive power? And of course, the answer is no, because it was given to the President, not Congress. Congress gets to play with the legislative powers, not the executive powers. Article 3, Section 1, the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court. You guys remember when I told you that every government, whether it's a dictatorship or a democracy, has three branches of government: the legislative, judicial, and executive powers. This is an incredibly important idea. This is how our system separates them. Okay, it's written into the Constitution. If you guys like analogies, I love analogies, you can think of separation of powers as a bucket. Okay, imagine that a bucket, our power bucket here on the slide, holds all the power the people have. Now, that's because popular sovereignty. All power for the government is derived from the people themselves. From that bucket of the people's power, you're going to create a government. Okay? So you're going to pour, metaphorically speaking, a certain amount of power into three buckets: your legislative power bucket, your executive power bucket, and your judicial power bucket. Now, you pour a little bit into the legislative power bucket, you pour a little bit into the executive power bucket, and you pour a little bit of the people's power in the judicial power bucket. Have the people given away all of their power? Well, presumably, the answer is no. If you shake the bucket, the people's power bucket, there should still be some power sloshing around in there. Those are reserved powers. Those are powers reserved to the people. The power that you gave the legislative branch, that's in the legislative branch bucket, is those powers vested by the people for the legislature and so on. Okay. Now, checks and balances places further limits on each branch's power as explicit restraints held by the other branches. The idea of the framers was to check and balance, I hate to use that term again, but was to balance the operations of government by placing explicit checks or requirements that other branches had on the exercise of power in the executive branch or the legislative branch or the judicial branch. Okay, the idea was that no one branch would have too much power and be able to exercise independently of the other two branches' checks. Okay, the idea being, of course, to avoid despotism, to avoid a tyranny. So what's an example of checks and balances? Well, I got a bunch of them. Congress makes a law, but the president can veto a law. Okay, yeah, Congress can pass a law. Let's say Congress passes a law that establishes a extra tax of 50% income on all people with red hair. Sorry, guys. Well, those of you that have red hair. Okay, well, the House of Representatives adopts it. The Senate, a bunch of notorious anti-redheads, adopts it. Does that idea become law? Well, of course, the answer is no, because you know that the president has to decide whether or not to sign a bill into law or not. Let's say the president does. That bill Is that now law and all the redheads have to pay a lot more money? Well, of course not. There's even an additional check on the power of the legislature to make laws, that of the judicial power. Redheads will file a lawsuit against implementation of this tax, and the Supreme Court or the court system will, of course, put the law into abeyance because, hey, it violates equal protection, it violates unlawful takings. It's violative of any number of clauses in the Constitution, besides just being silly. There's lots of other examples of checks and balances that are listed on this slide. The idea is that no power can be exercised under the Constitution without having to kind of make sure that it's okay by some other branch. So how does separation of powers and checks and balances fit together? Well, they're two sides of the same coin. The idea of both is to limit the power that each branch has. Okay, so no one branch can dominate the government and become dictatorship. Or, if you like my bucket analogy, we have our three buckets of legislative power, executive power, and judicial power. So you take a spoon and take some of the legislative power and give it to the executive power. That's the veto. You take another scoop of legislative power and put it in the judicial branch. That's the power of judicial review. Okay, so now you've taken a little bit of power from one bucket and spread it into the other two. That's the check. And why are you checking it? To balance out the power amongst the three branches. Okay. Now, the principle of judicial review, which I just mentioned, is one that you probably studied at some point in U.S. history. Now, its origin is not in the Constitution. The Constitution was, of course, ratified. The U.S. Supreme Court essentially gave itself the power of judicial review through a court case called Marbury versus Madison. The facts are less important than, they're not really the point. The principle that is derived there from Marbury versus Madison was that it made the judicial branch co-equal to the other branches. Okay? It gave them the power to decide whether a law or regulation or decision of the other two branches was constitutional or not. If it was violative of the Constitution, then it wouldn't be a lawful or constitutional law or regulation or whatever, and would be struck down. Okay. Which brings us to the final principle, that of federalism. This is, as we discussed in the first week or so of school, it's the distribution of power on a territorial basis. Okay. Remember, the national government is responsible for national issues. State governments have other powers responsible for state issues. So who takes care of war powers, the military and all that kind of stuff? Well, national defense is a national government issue. Who takes care of roads and infrastructure? Well, primarily states should, because they're closest to the situation. Who takes care of education, public education? States primarily. The framers wanted to assure that local control was maintained over local matters. Okay, so an issue in Rhode Island was taken care of by the Rhode Island state government, not by anybody else. Okay. On the flip side, coming out of the Articles of Confederation, they wanted to assure a central government that was strong enough to act for the entire country. Okay, and they learned that from the Articles of Confederation, how much of a mess it was. So how do we distribute power in the U.S.? Well, you have your express powers that are contained in the Constitution, written directly into them. So Congress's power to tax, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. You have implied powers that are reasonably suggested within the Constitution. So Congress's power to create an internal revenue service is founded in the federal government's power to tax, plus the necessary and proper clause of Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18. Inherent powers that belong to a national government because it's sovereign. Okay, it's independent, so they can conduct foreign policy. Reserved powers are those powers reserved. They're the bucket, the power bucket, remember? They're the powers that the people don't give away to the state. Okay, and we'll talk about this idea of federalism as a floor and ceiling tomorrow in class. Well, actually, later on in class. Bye.